We're taught that leaving work is a math problem. Hit the number, hand in the notice, walk out the door. But watch what people actually do when they get there. In one 2025 national survey, roughly 70% of working Americans said that they had already considered pushing back the retirement date. And in a separate 2025 survey of older Americans still on the job, 40% said that they'd keep working, even if their financial needs were completely met. Take the money question off the table entirely, and 4 in 10 would still not leave. So something else is holding them back. Today on Escape the Clock, we're aiming to answer the question, what if you built the freedom to walk away, hit your number, and still could not make yourself leave? To answer this, I'll be joined by Gregg Lunceford. He grew up in Chicago, the son of a doorman, who was known by name to every executive who walked through his door. Gregg went into wealth management, and in 2008, he watched client after client get handed an early retirement package that they were financially ready for, but could not bring themselves to sign. Nobody in his industry could tell him why, so he went and earned a PhD to find out for himself. He's the author of Exit from Work, and today he is a managing director and wealth advisor at Mesirow. So today, we get into why that this may be the very first major career decision you ever make without a mentor, the 3 things that your job pays you on top of the paycheck, and how to negotiate a gradual exit instead of walking off that cliff. So stay tuned to find out why the transition into a life without work can feel so hard, and how to build a plan for the life that you've always wanted. Welcome back to Escape the Clock, the show where we highlight strategies and approaches for reaching financial freedom and earning the option not to work. I'm your host, Daniel C. Rogers. Here's something that is so obvious, but still a surprise. When you spend the bulk of your life grinding at work, focused on the day when you can finally escape the clock, the goal takes the shape of a finish line. It's natural to imagine a day of relief, excitement, accomplishment, like a marathon runner who crosses the tape and can finally catch their breath. A chapter ends, but it isn't the end of the story. A new chapter begins, one where time finally belongs to you. And that realization can bring some surprising feelings with it. The excitement of being done can turn, almost overnight, into anxiety about what comes next. The reason is quite obvious when you stop to think about it. It's that the work was never just a paycheck. Most days, work is a reason to get up in the morning. It's a title that implies an identity. It's the place where one can feel useful and needed, and can even create a sense of community and belonging. And those chasing financial freedom have a plan for the day the paycheck stops. But take away the rest, and many are caught completely off guard. And the research backs this up. In a study of nearly 2,000 adults, retirees reported a significantly lower sense of purpose than people who are still working. And a lower sense of purpose tracked directly with higher rates of depression and anxiety. Purpose is a difficult thing to wrangle. Chasing enough to escape the clock is its own purpose. But once that program is complete, the purpose that follows can be the most elusive of all. And yet, it is possible to design a life rich in purpose after the 9 to 5. It's a different kind of plan, but it's still a plan. And today's guest is here to walk us through exactly how to build it. Gregg Lunceford is a managing director and wealth advisor at Mesirow, with more than 2 decades of advising people into this stage of life. He holds a PhD in management from Case Western Reserve University, where he studied the modern retirement transition, and he is a certified financial planner. He is the author of Exit from Work, and he has spent his career arguing that retirement is not an ending, but the start of what he calls the third age. Gregg, welcome to Escape the Clock.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you about this because when I wrote my book, I didn't only focus on the financial stuff, even though that's what people were asking me for. I did focus on the transition piece because it was one I personally struggled with. Like a lot of what I just said there are things I personally experienced. So I'd love you to take us back to like 2008 when you started seeing clients who were going through these retirement packages, people that you knew were financially set and who should have been really thrilled about what was coming, but kind of freezing in the moment. What was that like and what did you observe?
Yeah, so how this all got started is 2008. We're in the real estate crisis. We have double-digit unemployment. People are losing their jobs left, right, and center. And when I came into the industry over 30 years ago, we were taught that the decision to work or exit work was an economic choice. If you could financially afford to do it, you wouldn't do it anymore simply because people have other things that they have not experienced, and this would free up time and availability for you to do it. And I remember, I'm not trying to pick on any competitor here, but I remember seeing commercials on television, and you might remember this one too, specifically, where one day people were walking down the street going to work, and commercial was, "What is your retirement number?" And everyone had a thought bubble in their head that had a number in it, as if you hit that number in terms of your investment savings, you were immediately out. And so that's how we were conditioned to approach people as advisors. And so it's 2008, and we had a number of people come in our office for consultations that when we did all the analysis, they were at their number, but the sales cycles were long, just as long as any other sales cycle. If anything, I was noticing and making the argument that they were longer. And so I was making the argument to the company that I worked with at the time. I was like, this is counter to what we were taught coming in, because they've hit the number that's in the bubble in their head, yet they come back and they ask us for another meeting. And so we were getting into 3-4 meetings where you were going over the same Monte Carlo analysis model, all the things you do with your advisor to go over cash flow and readiness and all of that. And they weren't budging, and something wasn't right. And I mentioned it, and they said, well, it's probably us and a couple of competitors, and whoever does it, that they like, all things equal, whoever does it for the least amount, that's who they'll pick. So they said, go and discount the pricing and see if they will come on as clients. And we would discount. Sales cycle didn't change. And so my argument back was, I think there's something we're not understanding about prospects, clients, what happens at this phase or whatever. And people were like, no, that's not it. It's economic choice. Or when some people, I talked to them, they would say, even if it's not an economic choice, it's not like we can build a product around this. If someone is afraid of they're going to run out of money, you can build an annuity product. If they're interest rate sensitive, there are things that you can do, but you can't build a financial product around someone what they're feeling or expressing. And so I quickly said, you know what? I don't think we're right here. I would like to explore this. And so as I got into my study and I started to come up with some findings, then I think the aha light bulbs came on for not only me, for a number of people. But that's how we got to this point, because I was really trying to figure out what happens. And when we talk about retirement, one of the things that I learned is up until that point, there was a ton of literature out there. The majority of it was looking at retirement through the lens of gerontology. So it was the aging process. The thing that makes what I do and what I explain in my book, Exit from Work, and what my research difference is, there was not an account of what happens when longevity increases. And so now what used to be a 5-year, 10-year horizon could easily be a 30, 40-year horizon. You could easily, depending on what your profession was and how successful it was, and you may be an example of this, you may spend more time in your second act than you did in your first act.
Yeah, longevity risk, it's a real thing. A lot of people, when they get to that transition point, and maybe they do have an FI number, and maybe they've hit that FI number, and they have that excitement about knowing they could transition, but you've called this the phenomenon of retirement. There's like an emotional aspect that holds people back. I think I went through that myself. I delayed my retirement 6 months, even after I was done. I kept leaning into the math, the numbers. Well, what other financial thing might I not have thought of? Would I live too long? What would happen here? What would happen there? Can you get a little bit into what you started to learn about that fear and how people don't always even name that fear? They always kind of lean back into the math again to kind of avoid it.
So it is a phenomenon, not only a phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon, simply because one of the things that drives this is the fact that we're all living longer. No matter where you live in the globe, our longevity is increasing. And so we have not changed policy to catch up with our reality is. So when we put systems in place like Social Security, there was this arbitrary age of 65 that was put in place. And so everybody just goes, when I turn 65, well, certain things should happen and I have to make a decision, which is a binary decision. Either I'm in the workforce or I'm out of the workforce, and I don't have much control there, which gives people a bit of anxiety. And so what I'm trying to demonstrate and explain, and is what other academics and other communities have started to research, and we'll talk about about the third age research is that no matter where you live on the globe, you can't escape this. And it may be a little bit easier depending on what country you live in, because the policy around pension systems and things like that and Social Security and healthcare are a little bit different. But everybody's going to face this. What I found when I was starting to do experiments and interview people or test people that were, and the scope was like people who were maybe 5 years before or maybe in their first couple of years in the process, because what I was trying to understand is the transition. What most people like to talk about is what happens once you get there, but the transition, I think, is where the mystery was. And what I found was finding number one, this is a scary experience. And you would think that this would not be scary for people who are very well known for mastery of certain things. You know, whether you are the best person who practices what you practice, or law and medicine, or you're your best teacher, or you're the best plumber, or whatever it may be, you're known for this. So you built a reputation. You would think that there's no fear to this person. They're Teflon. But for a lot of people, this is scary. And the reason it's scary, the first one being is ageism is real. And so if you walk out of the workplace and you decide 6 months later made the wrong decision, no one's going to give you your job at the top of the pyramid back. It's gone, right? So for a number of us, this is an irreversible decision. The other thing is when I sat down and I talked to people about how they got where they got in their careers, regardless of what role they played, if it was the smallest role in the organization or the largest role in the organization, it seemed as though, especially if you were an older boomer, I think it changed a little bit for people who started their careers in the 80s because there was a global recession in the 80s, but definitely those before when there was great economic prosperity. When you ask them, you know, how did you develop your career? It was usually a mentor. They had a mentor or someone who guided them. Mentorship like we get when we're in, you know, high school or in college, but no longer exists once you walk in the workforce. But there was someone who put their arm around them and said, you know what, there's an opportunity in Cincinnati. I think you'd be great at it. There's an opportunity over here. I think you'd be great at it. And when they get to the stage where they're ready to exit out, that mentor and that support is gone. So it was interesting to me and eye-opening is the retirement decision. Not only is it a scary decision, but it may be the first major career decision a lot of people make independently. Therefore, you're unsure of yourself.
I think a lot of people think about the core philosophy of I need to replace my paycheck and then I'll feel confident and I won't have a lot of these fears. But you teach that it's more than that, that work pays these for kind of non-financial paychecks.
Correct.
And basically can start to kind of audit yourself. They were achievement, community identity, and structure. Can you talk about these 4 paychecks and how someone needs to use that to help understand where they are and how to transition?
So there are actually 3. The fourth one would be the economic part of it. So there are 4 benefits of work. The first one would be economic, which is the one we always think about. We get cash from our role. I think when we get to the end of the stage, we then realize that there are non-economic benefits from work. The first one is psychological success. Work gives us meaning and purpose in that we become known for doing something. And who doesn't like or who doesn't respond positively when they're getting accolades for doing something very well? Whether you have the smallest position in the organization or the largest position in the organization, someone relies on you to perform your function every day. And if you do it well, they value you because you performing your function makes them better at their function, right? We can't get to our desk if we can't get into the garage and there's somebody there every day to greet us when they're opening the gate to the garage. That function is important, you know, and one of the people that I look at was my father, who was a doorman. And most people would look at that as just a basic blue collar role. But when I was in college, I went to school a couple blocks away from my dad. So I'd come see him at work and I watch him work the door. And I watched this political capital that he had built, even though he didn't have the biggest paycheck. My dad knew everyone who entered that. As a matter of fact, at one point in his career, the Chicago Tribune named him one of Chicago's most adorable doormen. So you would think, how could you at a door, you know, and your basic interactions with people get that kind of notoriety? But my dad did that. And so when I started my professional career and people say, well, where'd you grow up and what'd you do? And I said, my dad was a doorman as a Drake. I was a first generation kid going into a large corporation and there were executives that knew my dad. It was like, your dad is Phil and he's on the Walter Street door. And so it was amazing to me how much political capital, even though it didn't come in the form of income, but for my dad, work gave him this high self-esteem. And I think we recognize that's gone once you walk out the door. The next one is socialization. Regardless of whether you like everybody you work with or you don't like everybody you work with, being able to go into an environment, have friends, and the ones that you don't like give you something to talk about, to laugh about with your friends. Socialization is very important. And a lot of people go into the things that you've mentioned, clinical depression and anxiety and all those things after they exit work simply because they don't know how to replace that. And then just notoriety, which we kind of talked about. But, those are the things that you really need to think about how you replace those things before you exit from work.
So people like me are in their 40s, people in like FIRE, the FI community, they'll typically trying to make work optional younger in life, right? And I know the longevity thing has to be something they have to think about and mitigate. But of those non-financial paychecks that you covered, especially community, how does someone at that younger age of life go about rebuilding that when everyone else they know is still working?
Yeah, that's hard. And when I started my study, I was trying to find a cohort of individuals that exited work where they were young enough, where they would have 2 to 4 decades of lifespan ahead of them, potential ahead of them, that had no financial need. And I thought about it and it was very hard. And then I realized that it's professional athletes. Professional athletes leave the game in their 30s, if they're lucky. There's a rare exception like with a Tom Brady that's 40, but usually you're gone in your 20s or your 30s, right? And you have this longevity in front of you. And you look at the behavior many of them have been demonized for in the past, I think is changing, where people go, I don't understand how this guy made all this money and has all these things and the world knows who he is and they bow down to him, but they engage in this dysfunctional behavior once they leave the league. And what you're now starting to see is that people across professions are, if they don't prepare for this, have the same dysfunctional behavior. There is this need for belonging and being around other people and engaging. So one of the things that I tell people before you exit out of this, a couple things you try to consider. Now, the people that I've seen be highly successful are people that can negotiate with their employer, but I know this isn't for everybody, where they can sort of have a gradual exit from work. In Japanese culture, it's called decompression. They actually allow their executives to start to decompress their responsibilities and get demoted as they end their career so that they gradually walk out the door. The happiest people I've seen are people who their companies allowed them to negotiate terms. So one of the people that I talk about in my book, now he was in a position where he had more of an advantage because he was a C-suite executive. So he had more of a personal relationship, but he went to his company and said, look, I know we're going to have a conversation about succession planning soon. I'm going to be proactive. I would like 3 years to gradually transition out of my role. And in that 3 years, this is what I'm going to do. I have 75 direct reports. I want to help you pick my successor. If you let me keep my title, I will give them my direct reports. You benefit from me grooming my successor in this role, right? And that way you don't have this disconnection. And I think also when you negotiate this, a lot of people go to their employer and say, this would be good for me, but you have to make the case of why this is good for the organization, you, me, and the organization, I think, to win. But he said, I want to be able to pick my successor and so on and so forth, as I mentioned. The other thing is I want to go from 5 days a week to 3 days a week. And this is what I want to do. And we'll prorate my salary for 3 days a week. And then there is an organization, a group of organizations that we support as a company philanthropically. I want you to donate my time to them 1 day a week. Because oftentimes people default into what we have been told you're supposed to do in retirement. Well, you're supposed to retire and become a volunteer. Everyone doesn't like volunteering, right? Some people actually like working. They just want to change the structure as you have. And then he said, the 5th day, I just want a day off. Well, this gave him an opportunity to see before he fully exited out how much he was committed to work, how much he was committed to leisure, how much he was committed to social service, community service in his community. And so I think one of the things we should try to do is try to structure that for ourselves. Now, everyone's not going to be fortunate enough to structure that for themselves. So I think another thing you should do before you exit out is try to layer your socialization. And so just like we teach people how to create a bond ladder, in my book, I talk about you need to develop a social ladder that looks like a bond ladder. you need to develop friendships that are one generation ahead of you and one generation behind you. And why do I say that? Well, the generation ahead of you could tell you their pitfalls or their challenges when they were making the transition. So that friendship is important. Then at your peer level, you have lots of friends, but a lot of times people go into retirement and their peer group deceases or moves away or something like that. And so where's the next peer group? Well, if you start to develop social relationships with one generation below you, now you have another peer group that has longevity in your community that you can still continue to interact with. So I think those are two strategies that I encourage people to try.
What about people a little bit older? Because there was a study last year by the Social Security trustees report that came out that said that remaining life expectancy at age 65 is now about 20.6 years up. Mm-hmm. That's a 13.7 year increase from the 1940s, which is basically a 50% increase in the length of retirement that you might expect if you were to retire in your 60s. That's, 20 plus years of time someone needs to fill. So the 65-year-old versus the 45-year-old, should their strategies be different? They still have a lot of time to fill, but not quite as much as that 45-year-old.
Yeah, though 60 is a new 40. So you're hitting on it exactly right. The 65-year-old should have a strategy as if they were 45. If you look at some of the tables and the data that you mentioned there, it is not impossible. As a matter of fact, when we look at the required minimum distribution, they do the calculation on a life expectancy of around 90. And so maybe even a little higher now. If you're leaving in your 60s, but your life expectancy could easily be your 90s, when you were leaving, you're really leaving at middle age. Well, in the 20th century, no one told a 40-something, you forget about it, hang it up. The 40-something was trying to figure out action plans so they could get to 60. And so the same thing has to happen here. We need to be very proactive about trying to figure out how to get that same, we are middle age. That's exactly right.
You had this idea that you call the ideal self. And I like that a lot because I feel like a lot of what I went through and what I help mentor people with is trying to understand what type of purpose drives them outside of the structure that work provided, because you have to provide that structure to your life without all those extrinsic things doing it to you. So how does someone start to picture who they want to become after work? How can they get through that process?
You have to be very intentional about that. That's a big part of it. So for many of us, we spend our lives working on, there's the ideal self, that's who you ideally want to be, and there's the ought self. The ought self is who society, your family tells you you want to be. I find this one especially hard with older boomers because you grew up in the 40s and 50s when there were a lot of societal expectations. People weren't breaking norms. It wasn't as easy to go tell your parents, you know what, I'm dropping out of college to start a computer company out of a garage. I mean, that was just totally unacceptable. So a lot of people were pushed down tracks or into careers that were what society felt were as good and respectable careers. And so when I started to interview people who were like heads of hospitals or head partners and things like that, and I say, how did you get in your career? It would be like, my dad told me this would be a great career. And so it was just really interesting to me when I started talking about them, what was their next thing that they wanted to do if they could do anything. It was so counter to what they did for a career. I'd have accountants saying that they wanted to start writing mystery novels. I'd have, surgeons saying that they wanted to start rock bands out of the garage and just jam out all day. I had a lot of teachers saying they just want to hang out at Disney. They didn't mind being a Disney worker every day because they were around children and they're having fun on their own terms. And so what the ought self and the ideal self is, there's this thing you've been told you ought to do, and this is what you did as a good kid, this is what you did as a good person, this is what you did as a good citizen. But there's this thing you never got to do before that you always wanted to do that you probably didn't want to speak out of. That's your ideal self. And so what you should do as you're thinking about this retirement identity is to figure out where this gap is. And if you could ideally satisfy all those things in your ideal self, what would you do next? And the ideal self and the ought self, there is a gap. There's a distance between the two. And there's supposed to be some distance. A little distance is healthy. But when there's a broad distance between ideally who you want to be and who you ought to be, then that triggers regret. And the wonderful thing I think about the third age period is you now get to solve for what you ideally wanted to do. You have time to do it. You have this 20-year life bonus that you could go back and correct away from what you did when you thought that's what everybody expected you to do. You can go do what you really want to do. And not only that, you're wiser than you've ever been when you go into this stage because you have life experiences. You've accumulated something, hopefully, so you're wealthier than you ever been. Even if it's not a large amount of money, it's definitely more than you had when you were 15. And you have satisfied all your obligations for the most part to other people. You've raised your family. I know people get sandwiched with having to take care of parents, but for many people, when you can manage that or that's not your reality, this is truly your time. And if you figure out a good plan for yourself and execute on it by putting together a planned vision for yourself, this will be the most phenomenal stage of your life.
Absolutely. Greg, when I started out, I'm just so happy that I could just kind of start getting over the burnout of work, that I just learned the lesson quickly that time is very liquid and it will fill just by not having a plan. It just fills itself. And I was not really enjoying how busy I got with thrashing around on things that wasn't really the things that were providing a lot of value in my life. But then when I started to deliberately decide how I wanted to spend my time, and that structure came together, it's been extremely fulfilling. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what is the real difference between filling your time versus actually designing it.
That's a great point. And one of the findings that I had was when I interviewed people, they looked at their friends who were retired. They envied the flexibility they had with their time, but they did not feel as though they were doing meaningful things in retirement. So that made retirement look unattractive to them. They felt as though that they were going to play bingo on Wednesday because that's what you were told you're supposed to do, or you were to go to the bowling league. And so when I would talk to them, they would say, I would retire, but I view the things that I see other retirees that I know do as things that just don't add value. And so a number of people know how to fill their day. You're just accounting for time. And so I think back to when I was doing my research and I started talking to people, they would start telling me stories about what their parents did. And one guy says, my father, or is his father-in-law, I think it was, gets up every day and he checks the pricing at the store. So he'll pull out the sales paper and it'll say, Walmart has green beans on sale, whatever. And he would go to a couple other stores to see if someone was lower than them. He was just filling his day. He just didn't have anything. It wasn't adding any value. It wasn't making him feel more fulfilled, but he was just bored to death and had to do something with his day. And I think a lot of people, if you sit down and you wait for retirement to happen to you, right? And a lot of people go, well, I'm 65. I got this notice in the mail that, do I want to sign up for Medicare? I guess I have to leave. No, you don't. If you don't want to do it, right? Or that doesn't mean that you can't take an action to do something that you would find fulfilling. A lot of people are very successful at this stage becoming entrepreneurs. And I know you've talked to some people who have done some awesome pivots. So just because society tells you this is what the norm was, doesn't mean that you have to follow it. You get to set your own course. And what people don't realize is if you follow the track that you saw before you, in many cases, you're just filling your day. You're not doing something that's fulfilling during the day. And the things that are fulfilling are the things that cause us to thrive and live longer and have a higher and greater purpose. That is worth more than the money at this stage.
So, Greg, I think it would be really interesting to talk through what the transition is actually like for someone, because I know there's people dreaming of this, and hopefully they're waking up a little bit to the fact that maybe it's not quite as easy as you might think it's going to be.
Yeah.
So can you talk is there a honeymoon phase? And also within that first year, is there any big mistakes that people typically make?
So you're exactly right. There is a honeymoon phase, right? And the honeymoon phase could go from 6 to 18 months where you're just enjoying your personal freedom and your ability to do different things, even be a little lazy if you want to. So you're really not thinking about it. This also is a time where people stack a bunch of activities that they always want to do up. So we'll go back a little bit. And when retirement first started, it was never intended for a person to reach age 65. When the system started, the average man lived to 61 and the average female lived to 64. It was a rarity to hit the age 65, right? And so when you hit 65 and they came to you and said, okay, we're going to start giving you this annuity payment from work and you also get annuity payment from the Social Security system, people said, I now have this financial freedom and I'm trying to cram as much as I possibly can in, because typically I might last 5 years before some ailment comes, and then I won't be able to do these things. And so you got this concept of a bucket list. And so everybody started checking off these bucket list items. Well, now that we have more longevity, we have been conditioned to do the same thing we saw the generations before us. And we hit this bucket list. And in this bucket list, in the first 6 to 18 months, we get this honeymoon phase where we're doing all these things. And then we continue on with a few of them. Maybe we shorten them up. We're not taking as many trips. And then after that, we go, I'm bored. And that's what happens, which makes retirement now more challenging is, if you only got 5 years, bucket list becomes important. When you got 20 years, there are only so many rounds of golf you can play. There are only so many cruises you can go on before it becomes redundant again. And so what really has to be reset, and this is where we talk once again about that ideal self, is you have to look at it the same way you were looking at developing a career. And the unfortunate part is there's no coaching or anything that happens formally here. But when you think about when they were trying to get you to be your odd self, and hopefully for most people, their odd self was closely aligned with their ideal self, well, there was a high school counselor, there was someone in your family that was constantly asking you from the time that you could speak what you wanted to be when you grew up. And if you didn't come up with something, they would tell you what they thought it would be great for you to be when you grew up. When you got to college, there was a counselor, or you went through all of your credit hours, or if you went to trade school, there was someone helping you prepare. No one helps you prepare for developing who you ideally want to be. And this is where you have to be very proactive. And so the most important thing for you to do is create the vision, sit down and think about it and write out all the things that are important to you, why they're important to you, and how you will actualize. The other thing is, if you have a partner, it has to be a shared vision, okay? I could tell my wife that I want to move to Greenland. All right, that's great for me, but if she doesn't want to be a part of that in my next life stage, there's going to be conflict. So to the extent that you have a partner, it has to be a shared vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even your version of the ideal self, you might get pushback on it. Like other people, there are status quos and stigmas about what people expect us to do. And sometimes they might not think we should go be that version that we think we should want to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I say this is a great time, because you satisfied your obligations to others, so you can act on that. On the other hand, bouncing it off a few people to see if it's realistic. I've seen some people go chase some things that may not have been as realistic. Problem that I find, and people often go, well, how does this tie into your role as an advisor? When you don't solve for these things and you're guessing at them, you can burn through a lot of money trying to find yourself. The pro athlete example I gave, a lot of people have gone broke trying to find themselves. They enter into business ventures that don't make sense, or they buy toys that you burn a lot of money on and then find out you really don't enjoy the toys, and now you spent your money on it. This is a really important time to really focus on that. And like I said, to the extent that you can negotiate decompression for yourself, that may be a helpful way of getting around this.
That's a great point. I actually really wanted to get your thoughts on when things go wrong. There's no guaranteed successes in life. And you just touched on some of the money reasons someone might have to maybe go back to work. AARP did a survey this year where they looked at the quote unquote do nothing version of retirement and when it fails for people. And so in that survey, they showed that 7% of retirees had re-entered the workforce within 6 months, and that 48% of them went back because of money, 15% out of boredom, and 14% simply to be more active and engaged. And I've actually talked to people who have left and went back to work for whatever reason it is that they decided they needed to do that. So what does a backwards transition look like? Is this a failure mode, or is it still kind of a step forward? How do you look at that?
I don't necessarily know that it's a failure mode. Actually, it's really a discovery. You discovered that you got out there and it wasn't right for you. And I think we have some work to do in terms of developing policy and structural work to deal with that. One of my favorite movies is The Intern with Anne Hathaway and Bobby De Niro, where in his 70s, he goes back to work after he loses his wife and becomes an intern. But there are what are called returnships, where it is you're an older intern returning to the workforce simply because you need to re-engage with those things. And what I found was a lot of people don't necessarily want that binary choice where it's either you're in or you're out. They really just are trying to redefine life on their terms. And so that's why I thought the decompression made sense. The happiest people I see are actually people who do contract work, who go back to their employer and say, I'll work for you seasonally, or I'll work for you, 20 hours a week or things like that. There's some people who just want a full exit, and there's like, I never want to see the place again. The point I'm trying to make in my research is you have options. The people who had to make a binary choice, that was because longevity was so short. But when you look at people who have done great things, Colonel Sanders the KFC franchise didn't take off until he was in the 70s. Benjamin Franklin signed the Declaration of Independence in his 80s. The Rolling Stones are about to tour again, right? I mean, you get a say in this. And the view is that society is telling me what I have to do, therefore I'm just going to go along with it. That's not true. You actually get a say in this, but you have to be intentional in thinking through this. So when it comes time for you to exercise your voice, you can lay out the best plan and other people actually want to help you with it. What I tell people is that it's not that employers don't see value in what you might want to do, especially smaller and mid-sized companies that don't have the size to hire large amounts of FTE. However, because we're in a situation where ageism is really real, no employer is going to feel very comfortable coming to you and saying, think you might retire next year, right? So this is something you have to be proactive. They may be thinking, man, I really could use this guy 3 more years, or use this lady if she were to maybe come in 2 days a week, but they're not going to approach you with it because they could be sued for it.
So I have a lot of friends who have a lot of worries right now. I have a lot of friends in the tech industry because I worked in the tech industry before I decided to take my early retirement. And at first, they said, I can't believe you would do that. I would be too worried to do that because like with how AI is going, would I even be able to get a job back? Like technology is going to pass me, all that kind of stuff. But now that tune has changed quite a bit. Now they're like, oh, I wish I had done what you did. I don't feel like I'm going to have a place anymore. I'm going to get laid off. You talk about wealth without worry, and I know a lot of it's about financial literacy, but how can someone get to that place where they can finally just enjoy their life?
You know what? One of the things I talk about in the book is financial self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is a little different than self-confidence. Self-confidence is, you just believe in yourself, right? Self-efficacy is when you believe that you can do something because there are things that you have control over, right? So I'm confident that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, right? Why am I confident? Because in all my years of life, at a certain time in the morning, the sun comes up and at a certain time it goes down, but I have no control over that. So what we tend to get into this whole thing of we have no control, but there are a bunch of things we have control of, and that is being self-efficacy, right? And so what we have to work on is that self-efficacy. A person like yourself that stepped out, you probably thought about it a lot and you said, okay, I'm taking this risk walking out of the tech sector, but it's not like this tech sector. And for a lot of people, when your work takes over your identity, you have this fear of taking this risk because your identity is so anchored in it. But for those of us who are able to think beyond that, and this is where protean career theory comes in, where instead of going up a traditional track, someone who has protean skills defines career success on my own terms. So career success is me being able to call my own shot versus me getting that next promotion. Success for me could be me making it to all of my kids' soccer games, right? A success for me could be me being able to have work-life balance because I have this hobby I really enjoy, and that's really important to me. And so people who have those protean skill sets and are very conscientious about building it, when it comes time to make this decision at the fork of the road, do I stay or do I go? Their self-efficacy is so high. They believe that if I walk out the door and I made a mistake and it failed, I can pick up and do something else. And it may not be walking back in the door of my old employer, but I can become a consultant. I can start my own business. I can convert a hobby into something. I will see another day. And so what happens is the people who are most fearful of this, and a lot of that tends to be people who are a little bit bit older. I think this is where we have to give Gen Z and millennials a lot of credit. We go, they're not committed to anything. Well, no, what they've learned is how to build these protein skill sets where they say, yeah, I want to be a CEO, but the requirements to be a CEO are not being in the same company. The requirement to be a CEO is to have certain skill sets, know something about marketing, know something about finance, know something about international business. I can get some of those in Portland. I can get some of those in Atlanta. I can get some of those in Cleveland. And collectively, I will have the skill set when the time comes to be a CEO somewhere, or either I'll start my own company. For those of us who were really grounded in the odd self by, our parents and society, that is more scary to us.
So Gregg, if you could leave the audience with one shift in how they're thinking about escaping the 9-to-5, what would it be?
As someone told me, never be afraid to bet on yourself. When I went on this journey, like I said, I was not fully supported. I just believed that I was doing the right thing. I believed that there was something that needed to be understood and that I could tell a story that would be helpful to my industry, right? But that's not to say I didn't get ridicule along the way. If you really feel as though the traditional exit and transition, as you saw your parents and your grandparents do it, is not feeling right for you, never be afraid to bet on yourself. Start thinking about who you ideally want to be. Think about how you could transition, as well as think about, if it doesn't work out, what are your transferable skills that you already possess today? Because they have value. You have a lot of relationships. They have value. You have things that you've learned along the way in your personal life and in your work life that has value. You can transition and be very valuable to a lot of other people.
Wonderful. Well, if listeners would like more help on this, how can they find your book, Exit from Work? How can they connect with you? How can they connect with the Mesirow?
My book, Exit from Work, this is a copy of it that I'm holding up. You can find this on Amazon.com. If you are looking for me, you can go to Mesirow.com and then in the search engine, put in Gregg Lunceford, Gregg Lunceford, and up will pop up my profile at Mesirow. In that, you will have all my contact information as well as a list of my publications outside of the book, podcast appearances, videos, things of that nature to learn more about me and learn how to contact me.
Thank you so much, Gregg. As someone who lived through this myself, I know you really know what you're talking about. So I really appreciate your time here and all the wisdom you had to share with everyone, and wishing you the best.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show, and thank you for sharing your experiences and getting the word out.
Think about every big transition you've ever made. Was there someone there helping you with the next step? Maybe it was a parent trying to help you decide what you should wear to school, or a teacher telling you which classes to take, or a counselor where you should apply to college. It could have been a manager at a job telling you what the next rung on the career ladder looked like and exactly what you were supposed to do to reach it. Life hands us these maps, and somebody is usually there to tell us what the next turn is, to help us along. Then we reach the biggest transition of our adult lives, leaving work for good, and there's nobody in the room. No counselor, no mentor, no directions. I went through that myself. I was 25 when I decided I wanted to be done with work by the time I was 45. 20 years earlier than what was expected. That was so far outside the status quo that I wouldn't even tell anyone. I only told my father and my wife. Everyone else just saw this hardworking guy who was good with money, and to be honest, a little too frugal. But every move I made was pointed at that date. I decided to make some moves, leaving Ohio for a tech job in Washington, switching from engineering to product management, then later program management, jumping from Microsoft to Google. I had this almost obsessive focus on progressing towards this goal. 20 years aimed at a single point. Not even one time did I think about designing the life that was on the other side of it. And here's the thing. That point, it's not a finish line. It's actually a starting line. And the road on the other side of it, it's much, much wider and is a lot less marked. Gregg said that for most people, walking away from work is the first major career decision they'll ever make completely on their own. So it's no surprise that the decision can leave us frozen. I know personally how that feels because I stalled as well. I hit my number when I was 42, 3 years before my goal, but I still didn't leave. I stayed another 6 months at a job I no longer even needed a paycheck from. There were no golden handcuffs. I didn't worry about losing benefits, and it wasn't like I had a lack of support. I had all of these things sorted. I had ran the numbers and then reran them again and ran them a third time. I even had multiple advisors review my plan to tell me over and over that I was more than fine. My wife was pushing me, and my doctor was pushing me, and I had even taken a 3-month medical leave and knew for a fact that I would be fine without the job. And with all that wind at my back, I still kept showing up at work on Monday, even at the cost of my own health. And that's what's so fascinating about all this, and probably why Gregg felt he had to go and study it. My plan was so strong that the plan itself became the reason I chose to stay. I knew that I could leave whenever I wanted, so it was just easier to leave later. I was hiding in my plan. And for most people, it actually runs the other way. In Schroeder's 2026 U.S. retirement survey of 1,500 investors, 64% of retirees said that they wish they had done more planning before they retired. Not more saving, more planning. Too little planning, too much planning. It actually starts to sound like the transition is just going to be painful no matter which way you come at it. But it's actually not. And that's exactly why I wanted to have this conversation with Gregg. Because the thing that's holding us all in place is fear. And fear, once you name it out loud, can be overcome. Because retiring well has almost nothing to do with a net worth or a date on a calendar. It means having somewhere to go before you have somewhere to leave. Your money plan, it gets you to a door, but few have a strong plan of what to do when you're on the other side of it. A second plan, one that will help us make the most out of this next chapter in our lives. And that second plan, it's not a feeling, it's specifics. If you can't name the things that are pulling you forward, then that fear will keep you exactly where you are. So designing a life after work, it's actually not so hard. It's not as hard as it sounds. I dedicated the entire final chapter of my book, Escape the Clock, to this one topic because it's that important. Because it's so important, I'm going to go through a few pieces of it now to help you get started with your plan. First, name what you're actually losing. The paycheck is the part you've already planned for. Gregg's research says work is paying you 3 more things on top of it. First, it pays you the feeling of being good at something. Somebody's relying on you and you deliver. It pays you people. You have friends at work. And even the people you can't stand, they can be good to give you something to talk about and to keep you somewhat entertained. And it also pays you standing, family, friends, and the people that you meet at a dinner party. All 3 of these things stop the same day that paycheck does. So walk through them one at a time and ask yourself, which ones are you most exposed on? For most, it's not the money. It's one of the other 3. Next, write down your vision for the life after. Gregg draws a line between the ought self and the ideal self. The ought self is who your family, your school, and your industry told you to be. The ideal self is the one that you actually wanted to be. A small gap between them is completely normal, but a wide gap is regret. And work will fill our time for us. So take it away and expect something else is going to fill it up. And if you don't choose that something, it's going to get chosen for you. The purpose, it can make all the difference because with it, that time will mean something. That might be taking the skills that you already have and using them towards maybe a new venture or finally building new skills that you always wish you had. Gregg interviewed accountants who wanted to write mystery novels and surgeons who wanted to start a garage band. I wrote a finance book. I started this podcast. I earned a wealth management degree. I volunteer teach finance. I work at a nonprofit, and I finished my debut science fiction novel. And I'm only in my 3rd year of my retirement. And that leads me to the 3rd thing. Don't be afraid to ask for a gradual exit. No boss is going to walk up to you and say, hey, want to go part-time and keep your benefits? Your employer may be quietly hoping that you'll stay on 2 days a week or something like that. Maybe they're worried they're going to lose you and they'd be happy to compromise, but they're not going to ever say it out loud because that conversation could become a lawsuit. So you have to be the one to raise it. And you might be surprised how it goes. Gregg's example was an executive who asked for 3 years instead of a resignation letter. He ended up keeping his title. He groomed his own successor. He went from 5 days a week to 3, gave one of those days to the causes the company already funded, and took the 5th day off. So frame it as something good for the company that's also good for you. And that is a door that almost anyone can go through. And then take a test run. if you can. It's important to know what you're getting into. Mine was a 3-month medical leave, but a sabbatical is much better. Even if it's unpaid, it's still worth doing, and that's actually maybe the best way to do it. And while unpaid time might sound frightening, that is the real trial run. If you can't handle a few weeks unpaid off, you might not be ready for that retirement. Last, work on building a social ladder. So much of work gives us is the people. Those relationships are really hard to leave behind. I work deliberately to carry some of mine forward, and I made a point of staying in touch and letting people know I value them outside the job. I even made it easy for them to schedule time with me. And Gregg talks about this. He talks about building a social ladder, the same way that you would build something like a bond ladder. Think about the rung above you as being a friend a generation ahead of you. This is a person who can tell you what's coming. The rung that you're at is your own peer group. And the one below you, that's a generation behind you, because those are the people that are going to be standing around there in 20 years. And that's the start of it. 4 tasks that you can put into a project for designing the life that you want to live after work. And with that, you'll have the start of a transition plan. And if that plan is filled with purpose-aligned days, then it'll pull you forward even as everything else tries to hold you back. If there's one thing to take away from this conversation, let it be this. So much of our lives is spent giving our time to other people. A good retirement can be the part where you finally give some time back to yourself. I'd love to hear from you. If you stopped working this Friday, what's the first thing you would put on Monday's calendar? Email me at contact@escapetheclock.com or leave a comment wherever you listen. I'm Daniel C. Rogers. Thanks for listening, and best of luck planning your life after work and escaping the clock. I'll catch you next week. That's a wrap on this episode of Escape the Clock. Everything you've heard today is for educational purposes only, designed to help you think, plan, and build a stronger financial program. Take what resonates, bring it into your Escape the Clock plan, and review it with a qualified professional before making any major moves. I'm Daniel C. Rogers, a wealth management certified professional and your host. The book, the free planner, and the one-on-one time with me are all waiting for you at EscapeTheClock.com. If this episode was valuable, please leave a rating, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll catch you next week.